In April 1986, as autumn settled over Australia and New Zealand, the region's geographical isolation faced a series of immediate, high-pressure tests. This 30-day window saw a concentration of events that highlighted a maturing national identity, one capable of producing global cultural exports while remaining vulnerable to international shocks. While the oceans provided a physical barrier, they no longer functioned as a geopolitical filter. Events occurring in the Northern Hemisphere and the Deep South began to resonate locally with unprecedented speed. This shift was visible across 4 specific arenas: a landmark cinematic premiere, an unsanctioned rugby tour, a rare celestial approach, and a distant nuclear catastrophe. Examining how these local milestones and macro-global events intersected reveals the complexity of a region moving into a more integrated and more volatile global era. The legislative context was set on March 3rd with the enactment of the Australia Act 1986. This legislation ended the power of the United Kingdom Parliament to legislate for Australian states, removing the final constitutional links between the Australian legal system and the British government. 7 weeks later, on April 24th, this formal independence was mirrored in the cultural sphere by the Sydney premiere of Crocodile Dundee. Directed by Peter Feynman, the film centered on the Mick Dundee character created by Paul Hogan. While domestic audiences embraced the comedy, its international trajectory was nearly immediate. It provided a specific, marketable version of the Australian identity to a global audience. By the end of its run, it had become the highest-grossing Australian film of all time, an unadjusted record that stands decades later. The film exported the larrikin archetype, an irreverent, outback-dwelling figure, positioning it as a central component of the country's international brand. This cultural visibility was followed by a sustained, decade-long boom in international tourism as global interest in the Australian landscape intensified. Simultaneously, the music industry in both nations was asserting its own domestic presence. In New Zealand, Dave Dobbyn and the band Herbs were recording Slice of Heaven for Foot Rot Flats, the country's first animated feature film. On the countdown charts, these local productions competed for airtime against dominant international acts like Billy Ocean, Whitney Houston, and Prince. The formalization of legal independence and the surge in cultural confidence were parallel developments, each reflecting a move toward a more self-contained national image. The combination of legislative finality and successful cultural exports allowed these nations to project a distinct identity to the rest of the world. In New Zealand, this emerging autonomy was tested by a sharp domestic conflict unfolding in mid-April. A group of rugby players known as the Cavaliers departed for an unsanctioned South African tour. The tour was a direct violation of the international sporting boycott organized against South Africa's apartheid regime. The scale of the rebellion was significant. 28 of the 30 players originally chosen for the 1985 All Blacks tour took part in the rogue expedition. Because the tour was not official, the team could not use the All Blacks name or the national silver fern emblem. Despite its unofficial status, the team was led by major figures in the sport, including coach Colin Meads. Their actions defied the New Zealand government and the New Zealand Rugby Football Union, both of which were under immense international pressure to uphold the boycott. The tour split public opinion in New Zealand, sparking a fierce debate over whether sport should be insulated from global political movements. The controversy highlighted the friction between the traditional amateur-era view of sport as an apolitical activity and the reality of its role in modern geopolitical activism. The scandal demonstrated that, as the Antipodes sought to define themselves, they remained inextricably linked to the moral and political struggles of the wider world. While political tensions dominated the news, a separate event in the night sky provided a rare moment of shared attention. On April 11th, Halley's Comet reached perigee, its closest point to Earth in the 20th century. At this specific point in time, the comet was approximately 63 million kilometers away. The southern hemisphere offered the best viewing conditions. The low light pollution of the Australian outback and New Zealand's high country allowed for clear observation that was impossible in the north. This scientific event drew huge public interest, offering a moment of collective observation that was, for a short time, divorced from terrestrial politics. That collective focus shifted sharply on April 26th. At 1:23 a.m., a massive explosion occurred in the Soviet Union. The nuclear reactor at Chernobyl suffered a catastrophic meltdown, releasing radioactive material into the atmosphere over Pripyat. News of the Soviet disaster reached Australia and New Zealand via satellite, appearing on television screens as graining, urgent broadcasts. The proximity of this news cycle, following so closely after a global celestial event, emphasized that the region's isolation was a thing of the past. The anxieties of the Cold War were now a direct part of daily life. Mapping these four events reveals the breadth of influences acting on the Antipodes in April 1986. Legal changes from London, political boycotts in South Africa, and nuclear fallout from the USSR directly impacted the regional narrative. At the same time, the image of McDundee was moving in the opposite direction, establishing a new and highly successful cultural footprint in international markets. This month captured a critical moment in the region's development, a period where these nations were increasingly acting as independent cultural and political agents. Yet this autonomy came with an unavoidable integration into a global system defined by rapid communication and shared risks. The forging of a national identity is a process of balancing local ambitions against global realities. It is shaped as much by domestic legislation and cultural output as it is by international conflicts and scientific phenomena. The events of April 1986 confirm that even at the edge of the world, a nation's story is inextricably connected to the broader movements of global history.